Hey, welcome back to ECommerce On Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Nathan?
Oh, amazing. I'm excited to dive in because I really did not know that much about fragrance. And this season, we are doing a fragrance deep dive. And so this episode, if you've ever wondered kind of the ins and outs about fragrance, how fragrance is made, the regulatory environment, how you could launch and scale a fragrance brand, that's basically what we're going to cover on today's episode. But before we dive in, for those that are joining us for the first time on E-commerce on Tap, I want to give a quick overview of what we do here.
Yeah, so each season, Nathan and I take a well-known category. We've done skincare, we've done athleisure, we just wrapped up supplements this season. Like you said, we're going to do fragrance. And what we'll do is after a deep dive episode, we're going to highlight some well-known fragrance brands that are out there. We're going to tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and talk about their X potential.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun doing so. Before we dive in today, were there any kind of tidbits that caught your eye the past week?
Yeah, there was one that I saw a couple weeks ago. It was that the Navy had signed nearly a $500 million deal with Palantir to manage their supply chain for sub maintenance. And Palantir is this big data, Peter Thiel-backed company that kind of make the data come to life and speak to you. And the idea is that, you see this big tech AI company getting closer and closer and more tightly integrated in with the military. And so there are some people with tinfoil hats who are saying, hey, this is a bad idea. There's a Stuntneck sort of thing that's going to happen. But the reality here is that if you have better data, you can manage your supply chain better. And so hopefully this takes costs out for the Navy.
Totally. Well, I think the Pentagon hasn't passed an audit and who knows how long. So
Maybe they'll
see,
do that next.
how much we're spending. I'm sure you've been to a Topgolf before. I mean, I feel like all e-commerce events at one point were hosted at a Topgolf. And Topgolf originally was valued at about $2 billion when it sold to Callaway in 2020. And, it's interesting because I think with all this AI, people are saying there's going to be more kind of in real life experiences. And I would think Topgolf obviously aligns with that. But there's kind of been a valuation reset where Topgolf is selling basically for 60% of its previous value to Leonard Green. So they're selling for, I guess that 60% is about 770 million. And then Callaway is 40% of it, but still, I mean, a pretty big haircut compared to their previous kind of 2 billion valuation when they sold. So, well, for those that are joining us, we've got to take a break and just ask you to like and subscribe. We've seen a recent surge in listeners, and a lot of you are not subscribed, and so it really helps spread e-commerce on tap for those that are interested. So please, if you could take a moment to like and subscribe, Aaron and I would greatly appreciate it. And we, as always, appreciate you tuning in to e-commerce on tap, brought to you by Sourcify and
Cool. Nathan, let's dive in. I feel like we should start by just defining what fragrance is. So is this just something that smells nice, or is there more to what fragrance actually is?
Yeah, I mean, fragrance, I guess, is not just a smell. Technically, it's a mixture of these kind of organic compounds that are engineered to evaporate at different speeds. So your nose experiences a sequence rather than a single note. The fragrance industry is massive and kind of broadly defined, right? There's personal care fragrances, obviously, like shampoo, deodorant, lotion, body wash, laundry fragrances. And these are really engineered for extreme performance, right? Because they go through a laundry that's got heat, water, agitation. And laundry is like, if you look at it from like a per profit basis, like economics wise, this is one of the most profitable segments. There's cleaning product fragrances, and they really have to mask these kind of part-based odors. And then there's kind of industrial scenting, which could be car fresheners or trash bags, textiles. There's a lot that goes into this.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways you could say that anything that smells good or that people use to mask another smell could be considered a fragrance. But I guess for this season in particular, what parameters are we going to set up for e-commerce on tap?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to basically ignore all of these and focus on skin fragrance. So, everything that falls into one of these two domains. So fine fragrance, basically worn on the skin. This is what most people commonly refer to when they say perfume. And so we're going to kind of do a deep dive on perfume and the different brands within that category. And then we're also going to touch on home and ambient fragrance. which is basically sensing a space, right? Like here in Utah, we've got probably one of the largest kind of home and ambient fragrance brands, Pura. And I know the founder Richie very well, and it's an incredible growth story to see their success. It's really been amazing to watch from afar. So, these formats could include candles, diffusers, room sprays, plug-in diffusers, which is what Pura is. And so it's kind of this really, I guess, unique stance in the market that's grown quite a bit over the past few years. What was, like, when you think about fragrance, what was your first time buying a fragrance, right?
Oh man, I think the story I go back to is middle school, and suddenly like people wanted these really strong colognes, and so I think I had saved up like $13 or something, and I went to Target and I bought this something. I remember it was this little blue bottle that smelled very strong. I don't remember if it smelled good or not, but I remember it said toilet water on it, and I was very like concerned, like, where did this come from? Like, did this come from toilets or what was it? It looked like the little urinal cakes that you might see in a urinal. But that was kind of my first fragrance that I bought, and I just remember my family making fun of me for putting toilet water on myself. What about you?
Oh man, I think about, it must have been like middle school or something where people were just like spray Axe like everywhere. I remember in like a locker room, people just like have kind of, I don't know if it was Axe wars or what, but you just have the spray can, you just like spray them endlessly, and kind of almost like you're attacking each other with Axe or something. Kind of crazy remembering that and that whole fad and trend.
We're gonna find out there was something in Axe that like caused the world to be the way it is now. And this is where we get into the history lesson section of the podcast, which I absolutely love. For the first 4,000-ish years of human history, fragrance was seen as ritual, medicine, also preservation. So most of human history, it wasn't a luxury, it was more about function. And so in ancient Egypt, you would see perfume was tied to religion and burial. Mesopotamia and Persia was really the start of these early perfumers, and they really helped to refine a lot of these methods that you'd see today, such as filtration and tincturing and solvent use. Ancient India and China were using botanicals extensively for medicine and spirituality. You've got ancient Greece and Rome, which really started to shift it from ritual to more personalized grooming. And so you saw at bazaars, people started to sell scented oils, introduce more of a systematic trade to spices and aromatics. But for thousands of years, fragrance was really known as a raw material trade, not a branded industry. And that began to change in the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, where scent became tied to hygiene and hygiene technology. And Europe really treated it as a health tool. And in medieval times, bad smells were synonymous with disease. And so I don't know if you've seen the old pictures of like the bubonic plague, and the doctors would have like these really long kind of beaks that were there. They would put flowers and stuff in the end of the beak, because the idea was that if they smelled good things, they were keeping all the bad things out. We know that that's not how germs work, and that good smells don't necessarily mean that filters things, but that's what they were looking at. That's why they would carry pomanders and sachets and botanicals really to ward off the illness. In the Middle Ages as well, you see a lot of distillation practices advance. So you've got Arab chemists, which perfected steam distillation and gave the world modern rosewater and other essential oil extraction. So this period was really where the technology was being refined and developed, but not really the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because for some reason when I think of fragrances, I often think of France. I don't know why, but France always comes to mind. And so I guess, how did France, or this version of France, kind of become associated with the fragrance industry here?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's not by accident that you think of perfumes and think of France. That kind of started in the 1500s to 1700s, where the perfumery really became a craft and moved from health over to luxury. And it actually started in Italy, not France. And the Medici family, who I'm sure you've heard about, they were the ones that funded all these perfumers and were kind of providing the seed capital, if you will, for this industry. And Catherine de' Medici eventually married the French king in 1533, and she brought her personal perfumer to France. And that importation of that perfumer and that family is what led to the beginning of France's dominance. And there's a couple of structural reasons why France began to dominate the perfume industry. The first one is there's a part of France called the Grasse region, and it's a small agricultural region that was already known for growing things like jasmine and roses and lavender and things that just naturally smell good. They also have leather tanneries, which use botanicals and others to mask the odors that you normally find in gloves. And so you had this really massive local skill set that was used to doing scent extraction and blending. And when you pair that with the royal patronage of the French court, especially Louis XIV, who was rumored to have a borderline obsession with scent, and he was, always asking for like a scent of the day and things like that. This created an enormous demand for perfumes and led to the creation of former guilds. And so France already had the lead in textiles and luxury goods and guild-based training, and so perfume slotted naturally into that ecosystem. So by the 1700s, France wasn't the only player; it was the player in fragrance.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that France saw this as a luxury good and something only for them. But I mean, when did this start to change, right? Because it really started to spread kind of internationally pretty quickly.
Yeah, that really started kind of like the 1800s. So you've got the Industrial Revolution, which creates what we would consider modern perfumery, and this was really a major turning point because you see the first synthetics start to come online. And these synthetics allowed new scent profiles to become possible, and it allowed scale and consistency. Starting in the 1850s, synthetic aerochemicals emerged, and alcohol-based fragrances became more of a standard. Before this, you were finding flowers and you were extracting them, and you couldn't take those so far. They were very brittle, right? And when people discovered ethanol as a solvent, it made fragrances lighter and airier, and modern perfumes more possible. And branding really begins to start in the 1800s as well. So Guerlain in 1828, Holbeaut in 1775, and later Coty, yes, that Coty in 1904, start to behave like modern luxury houses. And you start to see packaging become almost as important as the actual fragrance itself. And just a lot of amazing glassmaking and advances in atomizers, which help spread the scent out, really begin to take this to be more or less a luxury scent and more of a luxury object. And so if you look at this, you have the 1800s built modern perfumery, the 1900s really turned it into an empire. And I think you kind of have to focus and pay homage to Chanel No. 5, which came out in 1921, really as the watershed moment for where this went from kind of a niche industry to mass market. And it was the first major conceptual fragrance, not a literal flower. So everything before this had been trying to mimic something natural. And what they did is they said, let's just make something that smells good, that you can't really place on, that is distinctly Chanel No. 5. And so they developed this beautiful bottle. It was advertised globally, did really well. Further in the 1900s, you see Francois Coty turn perfume into mass premium products. And he standardized packaging, lowered the price points, and built out global distribution. And of course, Grasse continues to be the focal point in this period of time, where it was the global hub for natural ingredients and perfumery schools and things like that. And so France dominated not because of any one thing, but because it controlled these three things simultaneously. It had the raw materials, it had the trained perfumers, and it had these emerging luxury brands that were really setting the tone.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I kind of want to go back and double click on Chanel No. 5 for a moment, because I mean, this was really a watershed moment for the industry. And I think we should kind of dive into why it was such an important function for the industry, right?
Yeah, as I mentioned, before 1921, most fragrances were either literal flowers or they're very animalistic. There was no concept of a modern scent, nothing that was abstract, no idea of fragrance. And Chanel No. 5 was different because it was literally the first time that there was an idea. And these perfumers tried to evoke a concept rather than a flower or a resin. And so when people had first smelled it, they had literally never smelled anything quite like it before. And it was the equivalent of like rock music being plugged into an amplifier for the first time versus just acoustic. Like it was so groundbreaking and so different. And the bottle also looked nothing like anything else that was out there. There were no curves, no flowers, no frosted glass. It was architectural and almost clinical. And people really thought of it as a modern art object, really decades ahead of its time. And so perfume was really more of a design element versus something that was very concrete, like, oh, you want to smell like oranges, or you want to smell like roses, you want to smell like lavender. This was something that was inherently different.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how this makes it really interesting and a unique product for its time, but I guess what made it such a cultural icon?
Yeah, I guess looking back on it now, Coco Chanel was pursuing a luxury distribution strategy without knowing it. They refused to let number five become a mass over distributed fragrance and only allowed it to be placed in elite boutiques, not pharmacies. And by controlling the image and creating scarcity, they really controlled who could sell it and therefore who could use it. And really, Marilyn Monroe was the one that created the most famous unpaid ad in fragrance history. And the story goes back that she was being interviewed and asked what she wore to bed, and she answered, "Oh, just a few drops of Chanel Number Five." And this turned into, and it's like a huge viral moment because it was not just a scent, but it was a piece of seduction. And this lore was something that global brands have been trying to replicate ever since, but they've never been able to do it organically. And that's I think why when you see perfume or scent ads on TV, they're always kind of harkening back to the beautiful person and kind of seduction and stuff like that because of this off the cuff remark that Marilyn Monroe made about just wearing a few drops of Chanel Number Five.
Yeah, it's pretty iconic lines she had there, that's for sure. I mean, I can see how this created a new standard for what fragrance could be. How did the industry really begin to develop after that?
Yeah, well, you have to kind of look to after World War II. So that's where you start to see companies like Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, LVMH, Coty, and Puig emerge as fragrance superpowers. And they follow the same playbook that you would see in CPG. They acquire brands, they build global distribution, they license designer names, and they invest heavily in marketing. And really, this I think we'll talk about it later, but the licensing of designer names really changes everything because before this point, designers had been the ones to make perfume, but instead they licensed their name to Coty or L'Oreal or Puig, and this really allowed them to handle the R&D and the manufacturing, the marketing. But this is something where this model of licensing another person's name or a designer's brand is what's driving most of the market today. And so if you look at like the late 20th century, there's some niche perfumeries that are entering the market. There's brands like Les Artisans Parfumeurs, Diptyque, Creed, later Le Labo, which start to reinvent fragrance as more of a sensory art. But really, you start to see these niche power dynamics start to shift. Perfumers became stars again. They started to replace celebrity endorsements by having their own thing. And this really kind of got us to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing to see how this market has grown, pretty quickly, right? So the market today is about 50 to 60 billion, and people project it's going to get to about 75 to 100 billion by the end of this decade. The U.S. perfume market alone to grow from a few billion in kind of the early 2020 baseline towards 9 billion by the early 30s. It's a pretty high growth rate. And people always wonder where is growth the strongest here. So mostly emerging Asia Pacific, kind of these premium niche fragrance categories and digital channels and personalized scent experiences really are where the growth is happening.
I guess what are some of the major trends that are happening in fragrance in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, the internet. Consumers discover pure scents mostly through blogs, YouTube, TikTok, and Reddit. You then got kind of this Middle East fragrance culture that has, globalized amber, intense, heavy profiles go mainstream worldwide. And then you've got this dynamic global supply chain pressure that's increasing. So citrus crop failures, rising alcohol costs, and, geopolitical volatility that we've all been experiencing quite a bit, this year. And, clean fragrance emerges as well here. So you've got kind of natural, transparent, and IFR compliant marketing becomes a category.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really unique about this industry is that in beauty and food generally, there's a big push toward organics, clean labels, and really just all natural products. But that's not really the case in fragrance. In fact, you're seeing that synthetics are really the backbone of the industry. Why is that?
Synthetics are not shortcuts in this industry. They're really kind of, as you mentioned, the backbone of modern perfumery because they allow stability, consistency, and sustainability. And, new smells that naturally just the nature dynamics it doesn't produce. Many of the most beloved perfumes rely heavily on synthetic content because naturals alone couldn't deliver this kind of projection or longevity that we have in modern fragrances. And so, speaking of synthetics and suppliers, I've, always wondered, and now we'll find out. How does one go actually about making fragrance?
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. There's a couple steps. So the first step is you've got to align on the scent, and 70 to 90% of modern fragrances today rely on synthetics, and this is for performance, for cost, stability, sustainability, all those things you mentioned. And the materials that come into making these scents come primarily from just a handful of perfumer houses or formula creators. There are these 5 firms that control all of these scents, and you could kind of think of them as the Intel or the NVIDIA of fragrance. And interesting enough, I was talking to my wife about this. What I learned as we were preparing for this podcast. She's like, "Oh, these people don't just make the fragrance; they also make flavors." And so when she was using ice cream or doing other things, these guys will also make the flavorings that go into different things. And so she remembers walking to the factory and be like, "Oh, that smells like red popsicle," and that's because that was the fragrance or the taste that was going through there. So these guys control the chemistry, the molecules, the patent supply, and the benefit of working with them is that you get access to proprietary molecules and stability testing and all this sort of compliance stuff. Development fees can be anywhere from 10K to 100K per formulation, depending on the complexity and the exclusivity that you want to get from that scent. And the production MOQs are typically around 20 to 50 kilograms of concentrate, sometimes higher. And again, remember on what you're making, you may have something that's only 5% concentrate or 50% concentrate. So you can kind of do the math in terms of how much that yields. The second step that you need in order to create a fragrance is you need a contract manufacturer, or more specifically a filler. And what these companies do is they take the fragrance concentrate and they blend it with the alcohol and water to fill the bottles, label them, batch them, and package them. And major locations for this are France, Italy, Spain, Eastern Europe, as well as California and New Jersey. And these are the folks that you would actually work with if you're not big enough to work with a top 5 fragrance house, or you don't need an exclusive scent. Because they may already have a lot of this other scent available, and then they just maybe change the concentration slightly. The MOQs here will range from 1,000 units on the low end up to 10,000 plus for prestige. And it may cost like $2 to $8 per unit, depending on the complexity of your packaging. And then the third step is really the bottle, the cap, the atomizer, the packaging suppliers, those sorts of things. I think this is where a lot of new founders will get tripped up, because the packaging supply chain is complex, slow, and very, very expensive. Italy and France dominate the high-end glass section, and whereas China leads in affordability and speed. Portugal and Spain do some caps and closures, and there are certain sprayers or atomizers that are basically locked into a few manufacturers like Aptar and Silgen. And the lead times for these packaging elements can be anywhere from 12 to 24 weeks for custom glass, and the prices can be very, very different. So standard stock bottles may be $1 to $3, but custom molds may be 10K to 60K for the mold up front, and then $5 to $15 per bottle. Even just the sprayer, like the high-end atomizers, could be $3 to $10 each. And so when you look at this, the packaging is often the single largest cost driver for a prestige fragrance, as opposed to the actual scent.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I guess, what does this do for the cost structure in terms of margins and so forth?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the formula is very, very cheap. It's often less than 5 to 10% of the bill of materials, whereas packaging can be 40 to 60% of the total cost. That being said, the margins are still extremely high, and prestige brands regularly hit 80, 90% margin on these sorts of things. And as a result, because of the margins, because of how difficult it is to communicate an emotion or market an emotion, there's a lot of a marketing spend that goes into these brands. And so whether they be hero campaigns, sampling, gifting, testers, influences, all those sorts of things, this is where licensing groups will sink a lot of their dollars. And as I mentioned earlier, licensing really drives the industry. So most celebrity and designer brands don't make their own fragrance, they just license their name. And Coty, for example, has built a multi-billion-dollar business this way. So there's just a few things here of just how expensive it can be to build really the packaging around it. You're selling packaging and a little bit of ethanol and a sprayer. One thing that's interesting is just the regulatory environment of this. So Why don't you take us through how highly of a regulated industry is the fragrance industry? Is there any sort of standard or laws that people should be aware of if they're getting started?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, right? I mean, fragrance, you kind of think of it as this very unique category. And I think in general, fragrance is actually more regulated than supplements, less regulated than drugs, and regulated very differently than skincare, right? And so, fragrance kind of operates in this hybrid regulatory system where there's, government regulations that kind of set the baseline of consumer safety rules, while the IFRA sets technical limits, and then retailers like Sephora or Ulta might have another layer on top of this as well. So it's a very, dynamic regulatory environment.
IFRA, EFRA, what is that?
Yeah, so this is kind of the single most important body in fragrance, and it's kind of an industry. It's the industry organization, not a government agency, and it sets the global safety standard for fragrance ingredients. So they publish the IFRA standard, which restrict and ban hundreds of materials. So the IFRA controls really kind of the maximum usage levels of specific aroma molecules where ingredients can be used, the allergen thresholds, the sensitization risk, and if you don't comply with the IFRA, no serious manufacturer or retailer will work with you. So very important if you're thinking about going into, the fragrance category as a founder, you need to understand, these IFRA regulations.
Yeah, that's fascinating because this is an industry body that's self-regulating. You usually don't see that work out so well. What about the government side?
Yeah, so on the government side in the US, fragrance is regulated under cosmetics law, which, the FDA. Fragrance formulas are considered trade secrets. And so kind of brands can list fragrance without disclosing their ingredients. Obviously ingredients must be safe for intended use, but, there's kind of no pre-market approval required unless there's color additives. And the FDA really only steps in when there are safety complaints, products are, mislabels, or there's claims that kind of cross into the drug territory. The EU is actually much stricter than the US, like they are with many things when it comes to food and drugs. And so they have a mandatory disclosure of 26 plus known fragrance allergens on labels. And this list keeps expanding. They have more kind of stricter concentration limits for many materials, and stronger enforcement power than in the US. So many brands actually formulate to the EU standards first because, if they pass the EU standard, they're definitely going to pass everywhere else. And I think it's, as we wrap up this initial deep dive episode, what do you think kind of are the main themes that our listeners should be paying attention to as we go into the next couple episodes?
Yeah, I am really excited for this season and some of the brands that we're going to be profiling. If you think back to Chanel #5, it worked because the chemistry and the culture were moving together. And as we profile these next companies, I want listeners to think about, is there a chemical or technical breakthrough here? What sort of story is being layered upon that chemistry that's been there? The second thing is that the industry is global, consolidated, and very, very, very powerful in a very quiet way. And it may look really fragmented on the brand level because you see it's really easy to start a fragrance brand and everybody seems to have one, but there's really only a handful of houses that control the building blocks of the actual scent. And it's interesting because most brands or founders don't have much control over their product, as you might think in terms of where they're constrained and where they're differentiated. And so really it comes back to that first point about storytelling. And then the third part is that consumers really aren't buying smell, they're buying an identity. And fragrance is one of the most emotional consumer categories in existence. And people use scent to signal and identify, maybe anchor a memory, create intimacy, or express an aspiration. And so, discovery means so much more than just the technical specs of a product. And this is why packaging is so important. This is why sampling is so important. I mean, you think about going into a store and they've always got people here like, do you want to try this scent? They want you to see if you can have some sort of emotional reaction with that. And because of that, fragrance really behaves more like fashion than skincare in a lot of ways. But what about you? What sort of themes are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable to see in the fragrance category how daring brands really think in, decades, not drop, right? I mean, fragrance is kind of one of these few categories where icons outlive the trend, right? I mean, people still talk about Chanel number 5 in this industry. They talk about CK1. These weren't just kind of viral moments. They're kind of long-term cultural bets. And so I think it's just really interesting how, much of what we profile is about these viral moments, or, is it about this kind of hot new thing? And, fragrance is really this category that is very endearing with, a very large shelf life. People, I think, admire and respect brands a lot more in the fragrance category that have been around for decades. And so fragrance is, an ancient category running on modern chemistry, global supply chains, and, deep human psychology. But the brands that win understand not just how to make something smell good, but how scent, science, culture, and identity interact over time. And so I think that's really kind of what makes the fragrance industry so special, so unique, and just so different, right? It's not really about these kind of viral moments. It's about how do you create, a scent that is everlasting and that is going to resonate with people across decades.
Yeah, and despite that, you still seek for the viral moment because, you're going for some sort of aspiration, you're going for some sort of identity, and so this is just a fascinating piece. And as we started to prepare for some of these other episodes, just the idea of how do you market an emotion, how do you market an idea that it's very difficult to. Facebook hasn't gotten good enough to have you smell something through an ad, and so you've got to get someone to think like, oh, I'm going to be willing to try this not one time to buy it, but twice to try it, to make that a recurring purchase.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm excited for this season. For those that are, interested in fragrance, we're going to talk about some of the leading brands here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, we're going to share the ins and outs of their supply chain, their growth story, and, what we would do if we were going to launch a fragrance brand. So tune in to E-commerce on Tap. We greatly appreciate you listening, and leave a review, share with a friend, and let Aaron and I know what you think of this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought by Your Supply.